Russia is being forced to defend more ground with less capacity, and that is how authoritarian systems start to lose control. The core vulnerability is the collapse of concentration. The Kremlin cannot keep power, money, and force stacked at the center under sustained pressure. And when concentration breaks, response times lengthen, redundancy disappears, and coercion stops arriving on schedule. And that is when the state begins losing territory in function first, and then in terms of geography. Three layers are degrading in parallel: border stability, fiscal capacity, and battlefield communications. Border instability forces a dispersion across a wider surface area. Dispersion spikes the daily burn rate for troops, logistics, repairs, and air defense. Physical strain, it kills redundancy, so every strike leaves a longer backlog and a weaker next day posture. Meanwhile, communication friction slows decisions, so gaps stay open long enough to be hit again. And when the three systems degrade together, every fix creates a new vulnerability. Every redeployment patches one hole while opening another. Response times become predictable windows, and predictable windows, they invite routine pressure. And over time, the map turns into seams. Ukraine only has to keep pulling until something tears. Dispersion accelerates institutional erosion, and institutional erosion turns war cost into regime risk. Once the cash tightens, repairs and air defense compete inside the same finite pool. And when the state must choose between fixing yesterday and preventing tomorrow, it loses both. And this is how a war stops being a frontline problem and becomes a national resilience crisis. I'm Dr. Jason Smart. I'm a national security advisor to Kiev Post special correspondent. We are seeing the exact moment when the military force is meeting financial collapse. Ukraine's strikes are punishing the army, while the sanctions are leaving the Kremlin dry of cash. And the shrinking resources now are triggering fights between the elite factions as they fight over the scraps that are left. Confidence in the public is now tanking. They realize there's something going very wrong because the officials keep telling them these fairy tales, everything's okay, but they can see the mathematical evidence for themselves. And you can help us to break out to the world the truth of what's going on about the Kremlin's narratives and get it into the mainstream media. Subscribe now to help us reach 275,000 supporters of Ukraine. Please use your YouTube hype to boost this analysis and algorithm. Subscribing, like hyping, signals to YouTube that you want the facts, not low information noise. And you can always consider becoming a channel member today to support our efforts. Thank you. The revenue engine for Russia has stalled. It's quite clear. The 2026 federal budget is built on an oil price of $59 per barrel, but Ural's crude, at best, is selling for about $45 per barrel. This is $14 shortfall per barrel is creating a systemic crisis. In fact, it's so bad at this point that delivery friction has left 143 million barrels stranded at sea. This dead capital cannot be taxed, causing oil and gas tax revenue to collapse by 65%. This loss of fast cash is forcing the state to cannibalize other sectors just to stay liquid. And at the same time, this revenue collapse is triggering a massive $22.3 billion federal deficit just in January alone. The government spent $1.72 for every $1 it took in. This hole represents 73% of the total money brought into the Treasury during the entire month. That's a burn rate of about $500,000 per minute. At this point, there's no way for Russia to catch back up. A deficit this large is no longer a budget gap, but a structural failure of the state. Incredibly, January's spending consumed nearly 50% of the entire deficit target for the 2026 fiscal year. By losing half of its annual buffer in just 1 month, the Kremlin has lost all fiscal agility. With the annual plan effectively ruined by February, there is no margin for further shocks. The state must now choose between hyperinflationary money printing or mass asset seizures. This trajectory points to a system that's not just brittle, but one that is going to break, not bend, under pressure. At this point, it's very clear that Moscow is transitioning from a managed deficit to a predatory economy, where private savings are the only remaining line of credit. A state, though, that is forced to start going through people's bank accounts, to start emptying them out to pay for a very unpopular war, is not a state that's very stable. It's one that is putting at risk its entire regime. But there's another problem that Russia is facing right now. The system's failure accelerates when the rear demands frontline assets. And today in Russia, we are seeing that. Look at the situation in Belgorod. There's 220,000 people in Belgorod, Russia, who have lost electricity. They've lost heating. They've lost water. And what's incredible about that is that it's negative 19 degrees Celsius, about negative 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Russia could do more to help those people, and they need the city of Belgorod. Belgorod's important for planning the war against Ukraine. But Russia really can't afford to help them more, and Russia cannot help the front lines more. That's because they lack S-400s and Pantsers. Those are the air defenses that Russia most often uses. But why do they have a lack of them? Well, one reason could be because Vladimir Putin. Around his house in Valdai, there are in fact around 20 modern air defense units that are encircling his villa. What's incredible about that is that that is about a third of the number that protects all of Moscow, a city of nearly 20 million people. But he's unwilling to spare any of that air defense to help the people of Russia, or to help the people on the front line, or to help the city of Belgorod. But all of this is happening at a historically bad moment for the Kremlin, because not only is the front line becoming brittle and starting to break, not only are they low on supplies, not only are they low on soldiers, and they're out of cash, there's also the problem that today the people in Russia are starting to have some questions. Why is everything going so badly? And why are the authorities not being straightforward with us? Now, the Russian people, of course, are used to being lied to, but not so blatantly, not so obviously, not so clearly when their security is being jeopardized. But you can make things worse. And how you can make things worse is to make sure that Ukraine wins. And you can do so by checking out the first pinned comment below, right below the question of the day, and a video there that you should definitely check out so you understand the real situation inside of Russia. Right below that, you'll see how you can donate for the Ukrainian soldiers to get what they need to win this war. All donations right now are being matched, and I donate in every one of our fundraisers. Thank you. So let's look at the situation with communications, because that's actually probably one of the most interesting changes they've seen recently. Of course, you've heard about Starlink, how no longer can the Russians use it. But there's something else here that's really interesting. Telegram, which is like WhatsApp, it's a messaging app for your phone, is now being throttled inside of Russia. That is, they're restricting people from being able to use it. Now, there's about 60 million Russians that regularly use Telegram. But you know who else uses Telegram? The Russian military. So right now, when they've turned off Telegram, that means that the Russian military on the front, not only is it lacking Starlink, which they need to send missiles into Ukraine, to send things like drones into Ukraine, to coordinate on the front lines. Not only are they lacking that, they're now lacking the basic ability to communicate with each other. When the Russians communicate using their standard radios, that's very easy to intercept. Telegram is a little bit more complicated, but now the Russian government has decided to take that away from the soldiers. And it's a very rare occasion, but now we're seeing the Russian soldiers are very dissatisfied. The perception inside of Russia is this, is that the government is eliminating Telegram because it wants to make sure that there's no ability for people to turn against the government, that all voices are heard by Moscow. But the secondary consequence of that is that now, today, inside of Russia, the Russian soldiers are less able to defend the front. Now, many people have already heard that Elon Musk decided to make sure that the Russians could not use Starlink, which provides internet anywhere in the world, to the Russians. And that means that Russians can't carry out attacks nearly as easily within Ukraine, but also means the Russians can't defend their own front. But there's another attribute of this which is great, and that is that the Ukrainians realize there's a moment of opportunity in this. The Russians were desperately looking for people inside of Ukraine to come forward and say that they were the owners of the Russian Starlinks. Because if they could find a Ukrainian to register in their name, then it would be on the whitelist. There would be no problem for the Russians continuing to use that Starlink. The Ukrainians set up a trap. They set up a military unit that went online and found all the Russians looking for Ukrainians to register the Starlinks in their names. And by doing so, they revealed the names and the serial numbers for over 2,420 of the Russian Starlinks. And that means those Starlinks will never work again. But more than that, to add insult to injury, the Russians sent over $5,000 to the Ukrainians, thinking they were sending it to just normal civilians to thank them for doing the service. Those $5,000, they are now going to help the Ukrainian soldiers to get more life-saving drones. But these problems on the front, they're compounding for the Russians. And we look back at Russian history and we look how problems compound and how regimes become destabilized, we can see a lot of parallels. Let's think back in 1917. The rail strain turned a military problem into a political collapse. Freight piled up at stations, and essential shipments stopped moving. Food failed to reach cities, and fuel failed to reach factories. The front received supplies late, and the planning windows closed. Shortages triggered strikes, protests, and panic buying. The army was ordered to restore order, but command cohesion weakened. Senior commanders withheld support from Nicholas II as a result. As a result of that, the unrest spread. The Tsar, in the end, had to abdicate, and the state authority fractured across the empire. But after February 1917, discipline weakened and political agitation spread within the military units. The government that came after Nicholas II was called a provisional government, but it lacked reliable force to impose wartime priorities, and the army stopped functioning as a unified instrument of national power. And by late 1917, the Imperial Army dissolved into rival armed formations. That might seem far off, but Russia is much closer than you might think. What we see today is very simple. The same logic of 1917 works today. When routes are threatened, supply schedules slip and combat tempo slows. Convoys reroute to reduce exposure and distances quietly expand. Longer routes burn more fuel and increase vehicle wear. When communication, though, fails, that's something very bad, because at that point, it turns into a complex situation. At that point, the army is truly lost. With more targets to guard and less money to guard them, the system begins to break. And today in Russia, that system is reaching the breaking point. Check out this video to see why. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.